Isang magsasakang Tano ang pangalan. Lupa niyang sinasakay, tanging kayamanan.
Like horizontal.
Minsa'y nagkasakit, kaisa-isang anak, naubos ang konting pera'y hindi pa rin lumalakas. Sa asendero ay nangutang 100 piso lang. Ngunit ito'y madodoble, sa anihan babayaran. At kapag pumalya, madodoble na naman, madodoble ng madodoble, hanggat di mabayaran. Hanggang ang lupa niya ang naging kabayaran. May utang pa si Tano, nakikisaka na lang. Ilan ang tulad ni Tano, pinahihirapan. Sila'y marami pa ngayon dito sa kalayunan. Ngunit itong si Tano ay biglang naglaho nang siya'y makita doon sa kabundukan, kasama ng sandatahan. Siya'y naging mandirigma ng bukbong bayan. Tayo na't lumaban.
Hi, everyone. Welcome one and all to IN USA and ILPS US official book launch with Jose Maria Sison. My name is Nico. I'm with IN USA, and so we want to welcome folks that are joining us from different time zones and different parts of the US today. So folks will get a chance to engage not only with the author, but also other book reviewers that are with us, spending time to discuss a very important book that has recently been released on the People's Democratic Revolution by Professor Sison. And so for those of you that are joining us, we ask for folks to remain on mute unless there is a question that comes up. We're going to have Q&A that's submitted to those that are receiving the questions. So we invite you to engage in the chat with us, let us know and register your questions, and there'll be room at the end to be able to have a discussion. But we're expecting a lot of exciting and dynamic program for tonight. So I'm gonna pass it to Elle.
Thanks, Nico. Yeah, my name is Elle. I'm from Anakbayan UW. I'm also one of your co-MCs today. We're going to go to the next slide and look over our program together. So today, we're going to start off with a poem and video from Professor Sison, The Long Struggle to Freedom, followed by a review from Nato Reyes Jr., the Bayan Secretary General, followed by a performance by Bootleg Orchestra. Then we'll have another review from Pao-Yu Ching, followed by another cultural pagkatapos ng digma. And then finally, we'll open up the floor for questions for Dr. Sison as well as Pao-Yu Ching.
will connect.
Yes, if you didn't know, Professor Sison is also an awarded poet and writer, in addition to being an author. And so this was in celebration in honor of the reestablishment of the Communist Party of the Philippines, a poem that was recently released. And so we thought it would be good to share the incredible cultural work that Professor Sison also provides us, and with some good historical context. So we're going to play that video shortly.
It took more than 300 years for the Filipino nation to take shape and shake off the colonial yoke in hundreds of uprisings until the Katipunan and the people defeated the foe and won their freedom. Since the imperialist bird of prey cast its shadow and dug its claws on our beloved motherland, it has been more than 100 years that the people have continued to fight for national and social liberation. The last 50 years of the struggle has been most fruitful. The Revolutionary Party of the Proletariat, the People's Army, the United Front, the mass movement of the oppressed, and the People's Government. All these are ever growing in the archipelago and advancing in waves against the foe that rules the ever-rotting system of greed and terror and serves foreign masters that the people of the world detest. We see the rising trend of revolution amidst the crisis in the country and abroad that inflicts intolerable suffering and drives the people to struggle harder for their soonest freedom from tyranny and a bright future in socialism. We struggle long for freedom. We never give up, no matter how long. But we seize every moment to strike a blow against the foe and hasten the day of our liberation from all oppression and exploitation.
Great, wonderful. So we hope folks enjoyed that. Really powerful images, not only historically, but even relating it to the current fascist state today that the Filipino people are struggling against. So if you want to check that out, be sure to check out on YouTube, The Long Struggle for Freedom. But without further ado, we also want to welcome the author to share some opening words about the book. So again, the topic being around the People's Democratic Revolution. Professor Jose Maria Sison is founder of the Communist Party of the Philippines, as well as Kabataan Makabayan, currently serving as a chairperson emeritus as International League of People's Struggles. And so we're featuring their book today because it's a really important piece that is relevant to our current conditions. Folks that are curious about what is the solution to the three basic problems of the Filipino people. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to our tech team to share some of those initial words.
Dear compatriots and friends, first of all, I wish to express my warmest greetings of solidarity to the sponsor and organizer of this event, Bayan USA, my co-speakers, Professor Pao-Yu Ching and Nato Reyes, General Secretary of Bayan Philippines, and to all of you who are participating in the launch of my book, The People's Democratic Revolution. I thank all of you for making this launch possible. The book that is being presented to you today fittingly comes after the critique of the Philippine economy and politics in the Sison Reader Series, published by the International Network for Philippine Studies. It discusses the programmatic solution to the basic problems of foreign monopoly capitalism, domestic feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism that afflict the Filipino people in a semi-colonial and semi-feudal society. By reading the book, you can find out how the program of People's Democratic Revolution has been spelled out, propagated, and carried out in the last 52 years in the Philippines in the context of the constant interest and policy shifts of U.S. imperialism and the chain of puppet regimes representing the local exploiting classes of big compradors, landlords, and bureaucrat capitalists. The People's Democratic Revolution, through protracted People's War, has overcome so many campaigns of military suppression under the direction of U.S. imperialism from the time of the Marcos fascist dictatorship through the pseudo-democratic regimes of Aquino, Ramos, Estrada, Arroyo, and what more, Aquino, to the current Duterte tyrannical regime, which has been trying hard to surpass the Marcos regime in acts of treason and the use of state terrorism, mass murder, and wanton corruption. In trying to serve two conflicting imperialist powers, Duterte has put the Philippines in an extremely bad situation. He depends on the U.S. for the military suppression of the Filipino People's Revolutionary Movement. At the same time, he has allowed China to build military bases on 7 artificial islands in the West Philippine Sea. Then he mixes up the China Telecom cell towers and U.S. military facilities and personnel under the Visiting Forces Agreement and the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement in the same military camps of the reactionary armed forces. Taking advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic, Duterte has caused hundreds of billions of pesos to be placed under his personal discretion and disposal in order to commit plunder in unprecedented volume and speed in the entire history of the Philippines. He and his cronies have the huge amounts of public money that are supposed to be for mass testing, medical supplies, and economic assistance to the disemployed. He has further militarized the government and has railroaded the so-called Anti-Terror Act in order to legalize the brazen acts of state terrorism. The People's Democratic Revolution has scored great achievements since 1968. The Communist Party of the Philippines has grown from a few scores of members to tens of thousands. The new People's Army from 9 automatic rifles in 1 provincial district to thousands on a nationwide scale. Revolutionary mass organizations from tens of thousands of members to millions. The National Democratic Front of the Philippines from a few allied organizations in 1973 to the current 18, and the local organs of political power, constituting the People's Democratic Government in 74 out of the 81 provinces of the Philippines. The reactionaries scoff at the fact that the People's Democratic Revolution has not yet taken over the presidential palace in Manila after 5 decades of revolutionary struggle. But a new democratic government has already arisen in the countryside. The great victories of the People's Democratic Revolution have been achieved in an archipelagic country without cross-border advantages and in the context of major setbacks in the world proletarian revolution due to the revisionist betrayal of socialism and the rampages of neoliberalism, state terrorism, and wars of aggression. The chronic crisis of the ruling system in the Philippines is rapidly worsening and is generating far more favorable conditions for the revolution than ever before. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the crisis was already severe, but it is even more severe now. The Duterte regime has aggravated the bankruptcy and crisis of the system by siphoning huge amounts of resources to bureaucratic corruption and military overspending, masterminding the understated and even undocumented export of mineral ores and fruits and the smuggling in of drugs and all sorts of consumer products, and allowing the accelerated outflow of super profits and debt service payments to foreign monopoly firms and banks. When Duterte became president in 2016, the accumulated public debt of the Philippines was only 5.9 trillion pesos. Now it is 11.6 trillion pesos and will be surely more than 13 trillion by 2022, more than double the debt in 2016. The budgetary and trade deficits are widening fast, and the sources of revenues and foreign exchange are decreasing. The global depression is depressing. The demand for cheap raw materials and cheap labor from the Philippines and the resort to foreign loans cannot be the solution because there is a global plague of unsustainable public debts. The reappearance of the open rule of terror under the Duterte regime is a clear manifestation of the decadent and moribund character of the ruling system. The regime has terminated the JRP-NDFP peace negotiations and vowed to destroy the revolutionary movement as well as the legal democratic movement for advocating full national independence, democracy, economic development through genuine land reform, and national industrialization, a national, scientific, and mass culture, and the international solidarity of peoples. State terrorism is running wild in the Philippines, and the regime of terror and greed pretends to be anti-terrorist by equating the People's Democratic Revolution with terrorism. The campaigns of red tagging, abductions, torture, and mass murder directed against social activists, workers, peasants, women, youth, lawyers, and other professionals, religious leaders, and human rights defenders are sharpening the people's desire for revolutionary change and are compelling more and more of them to join the armed revolution as in the time of the Marcos fascist dictatorship. Even then, the Duterte regime tries to deceive the people that he will conduct free and honest elections in 2022. But the people cannot be deceived. They know that Duterte has corrupted the reactionary armed forces and police and turned them into his criminal accomplices, and that he controls the Commission on Elections and the TIM Smartmatic partnership. He himself has confessed that he must do everything to keep his dynasty and ruling clique in power in order to avert his arrest on warrants of arrest issued by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity and by the Philippine courts on charges of plunder. It is reasonable for the legal democratic forces to be in broad alliance with the conservative opposition in electoral struggle to expose and oppose the grave crimes of the Duterte regime. To counter the scheme for rigging the elections, to try to promote the election of patriotic and progressive candidates, and to prepare the people for resistance against the actual rigging of the elections. The Duterte regime offends the people and wittingly favors the People's Democratic Revolution, whether he proceeds to hold and rig the presidential elections in 2022 or carry out false flag operations to postpone the elections indefinitely in order to proclaim martial law nationwide and declare a pseudo-revolutionary government. The fluidity in the political situation in the Philippines pertains not only to the alignments and realignments in relation to the 2022 elections, but also to the possibility that Duterte would undertake false flag operations or invoke the pandemic to postpone the elections in order to remain in power. The broad masses of the people and the revolutionary movement must be prepared against any criminal move of the Duterte regime. The crisis of the world capitalist system has been rapidly worsening since the financial meltdown of 2006 to 2008. All major contradictions in the world are intensifying, such as those between labor and capital, between the imperialist powers and the oppressed peoples and nations, between the imperialist powers and the anti-imperialist states, and among the imperialist powers themselves. The strategic decline of the U.S. has accelerated what used to be touted as the biggest partners in promoting the neoliberal policy of imperialist globalization. The U.S. and China have become the arch political rivals among the imperialist powers. The rapid worsening crisis of the world capitalist system has resulted in the upsurges of anti-imperialist and democratic mass struggles all over the world, especially after the so-called Great Recession developed into the Great Depression of the entire world from 2014 onwards. These mass struggles are prelude to the resurgence of the world proletarian revolution. Both the crisis of global capitalism and the resistance of the people of the world favor the advance of the People's Democratic Revolution in the Philippines. The Filipino people must advance their own revolution not only to uphold, defend, and promote their own national and democratic interest against the imperialists and the local reactionaries, but also to contribute the most they can to advance the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat and peoples of the world for national independence, democracy, and socialism. Even as millions of Filipinos are abroad, they are in a position to support the Philippine Revolution as well as the revolutionary struggles abroad and carry forward the international solidarity of the peoples of the world. Thank you.
Maraming salamat po to Professor Jose Maria Sison for that really grounding overview and explanation just of our current historical, political and economic situation that really, is the grounding for the path we're taking, right, to advance the People's Democratic Revolution. Next, we're going to hear from our first book reviewer for the text, The People's Democratic Revolution, Nato Reyes Jr. Nato is the Secretary General of Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, or New Patriotic Alliance, which is an alliance of progressive and anti-imperialist Filipino organizations composed mainly of workers and peasant organizations. And Bayan was formed in May of 1985, committed to the people's struggle for national freedom and genuine democracy. Now, they're hard at work, or if not resting at home right now at 4 a.m. in the morning. Nato unfortunately could not join us today. Still, we're pleased to have this video message from him, so please give your attention to Nato Reyes.
The point is to change it. By now, we are all familiar with these famous words of the German philosopher, whose work shook the world and laid down the vision for a socialist future for mankind. In his latest book, The People's Democratic Revolution, the fourth installment of the Sison Reader Series, Professor Jose Maria Sison, or JMS, sets out to provide not just a sharp analysis of the history and the current situation, but more importantly, a roadmap and a way forward for movements seeking fundamental change. Indeed, the point ever since was to change Philippine society and the world. The book spans more than 5 decades of Sison's involvement in the struggle for genuine freedom and democracy and a socialist future for the Filipino people and the international proletariat. It is a snapshot of his work as Communist Party of the Philippines founding chair, as political prisoner, a most sought-after professorial lecturer after his release from prison, longtime chief political consultant in the peace negotiations, as well as the chair of the International League of People's Struggles, or ILPS. The book touches on a range of topics such as Philippine history, the strategy and tactics of people's war, the leadership of the working class, the crisis of imperialism, as well as the author's personal insights on controversial issues. I found it quite interesting and apt that the book would open with the original Program for a People's Democratic Revolution, issued in 1968 as one of the founding documents of the first CPP Congress, and would close with an updated version of the PPDR from the second CPP Congress held in 2016, or 48 years after the founding. To students of history and social science, the PPDR documents provide an insight and outline of what the revolutionary forces seek to achieve in its epic struggle against imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucratic capitalism. I find these documents very relevant today as the Philippines enters another period of elections where the mantra of change will again be used to sway the electorate into voting for certain candidates. While the upcoming elections would be crucial in ending the reign of terror of the Duterte regime, it is safe to say that the exercise will not bring about thoroughgoing change or a radical departure from current policies. We can even say that most of the candidates for president do not have or have not shown the public any comprehensive program of action and governance that seeks to address the fundamental problems of Philippine society. Thus, I would recommend this book to all presidential and senatorial aspirants in the upcoming 2022 elections, as I believe that they will find sound political, socio-economic, and social-cultural programs. A preliminary understanding of these concepts would also help the next Philippine president in resuming peace negotiations with the NDFP for the benefit of the Filipino people. The programs are not that complicated, but would require a lot of political will to implement if we go by the current standards, because this program seeks to eliminate the vested interests, both foreign and domestic, that have prevented the Philippines from developing. Presidential aspirants should really take a look at the following programs: land reform, free land distribution, and the elimination of rural poverty, national industrialization, support for local industries, and the building of a self-reliant economy, a national scientific and mass culture, free education at all levels, the right to self-determination of the Moro people and the national minorities, and an active, independent foreign policy. Putting together a comprehensive program to address the centuries-old problems in the Philippines in 1968 was a feat in itself. That these concepts developed and withstood the test of time and proven relevant today amid the ever-worsening crisis of Philippine society is an even greater achievement. Other articles in the Reader bring us back to the period of the eve of the downfall of the Marcos regime and the challenges of building a broad united front with the looming snap elections and the massive rigging of the polls. In the article Onward with the Struggle for National Democracy unite to dismantle the U.S. Marcos dictatorship and establish the democratic coalition government addressed to the CGP. We go back to the final years of the decaying Marcos dictatorship and how JMS, who was still in detention, explained the necessity of all forms of struggle, armed and unarmed, to defeat the dictator. While recognizing the immediacy of dismantling the US-backed Marcos dictatorship, JMS never loses sight of the need for fundamental change because he recognized that foreign domination and elite rule will remain even after the defeat of Marcos. In his lectures after his release from prison, JMS goes on to describe the Philippine situation after Marcos. He correctly pointed out as early as August 1986 that, quote, the Aquino government is not a liberal democratic government, but a pro-imperialist and reactionary government with a liberal democratic tendency or facade. It has not shown any determination to leave the confines of foreign and feudal domination, end quote. He points out that the new democratic revolution did not end nor achieve completion with the overthrow of Marcos. The lessons from this era are so valuable today as the nation confronts the prospects of a Duterte extension and even, ironically, a Marcos restoration, 50 years after the Marcos dictatorship declared martial law. That the Marcoses are now working to return to power, and with Duterte insisting on staying in power, one realizes how fundamentally unchanged the political system is, and how it has even taken a turn for the worse. In his message to the CGP, JMS explains the limits of the electoral exercise, even as he recognizes the need for the people to engage in all forms of legal struggle to rid the country of the Marcoses. He made a similar analysis of the 2010 elections in his solidarity message to Makabayan in April 2009. Quote, in my view, it is not possible to make a fundamental change of the ruling system through periodic elections, under the rules set by the exploiting classes and their political agents. But the electoral form of mass struggle is important and necessary whenever it becomes possible for the patriotic and progressive forces to participate and push forward basic reforms that respond to the immediate needs and demands of the people. End quote. He reminds us further that there is no error of electoralism or parliamentarism when there is no foreclosing of other forms of struggle that the people have the sovereign right to adopt and wage. There's also no error of reformism when there is no quantification that the struggle for reforms is the sole option of the people. While the progressive movement and their allies are gearing up for the next elections in 2022, it is important to note the limits of such exercise in terms of bringing about fundamental change, and why it is important to advance the struggle for national democracy. More than the battle of personalities, activists should be conscious of pushing forward the demands in the national democratic program, and to challenge those vying for elected positions to make clear their stand on issues. Make no mistake, whatever the outcome of the elections, even if Duterte and Marcos are defeated, a long fight to rid the country of imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucratic capitalism still lies ahead. It is during these instances that we appreciate how JMS is always able to relate the tactical with the strategic, the current issues with the fundamental issues. He is able to raise discussion from something as basic as patriotic leadership and connect this to the historical roots of the Philippine crisis. He was able to provide a timely analysis of China's incursions and aggressive behavior in the West Philippine Sea without losing sight of the strategic role of the U.S. in the Philippines as the principal imperialist power exercising strategic dominance. In his comment on the Philippine case before the ITLOS and the Arbitral Tribunal, in the face of the superior military might of China and aggressive actions in the West Philippine Sea, he states that, quote, the National Democratic Movement should take a long-term view. The future revolutionary government shall be in a fundamentally better position to assert national sovereignty and territorial integrity because it shall engage in national industrialization and become capable of producing the ships, planes, and other instruments to defend the country and the people. In his contribution to the 22nd International Communist Seminar in Brussels, Belgium, in May 31, 2013, JMS quotes the Communist Manifesto, that the battle for democracy must be won, whether the popular movement for socialism be in the imperialist countries or in the far less developed countries dominated by imperialism. The consciousness, organization, and mobilization of the broad masses of the people must be raised to a level high enough to effect basic reforms immediately and social revolution in the long run. He does not pit against each other the struggle for reforms and the necessity for social revolution. He tells us that, quote, there is a need for a working class party to lead the people in seeking basic reforms within the bourgeois political system and aiming for socialist revolution. Then, of course, there are the witty takes by JMS during his interviews with various journalists and writers. He was asked by Quincy Saul of Counterpunch if he thought the legend of the foolish old man who removed mountains could now be seen as a parable on the environmental degradation that happened even during socialism. JMS explained what a parable is, an allegory that references imperialism and feudalism as mountains. However, unlike real mountains, they are not natural objects to be preserved as a matter of ecological wisdom. JMS, the English professor, then explains what a simile is in Mao's more environment-friendly use of mountains to describe the weight of the deaths of heroes, while comparing the death of traitors to being as light as a feather. He says there should be no overstretch beyond the clearly literary intent, and no argument that Mao is against poultry projects. The struggle for national liberation in the Philippines, like the parable of the foolish old man, has taken more than 5 decades now. It is a heroic effort to level the 3 mountains representing the basic problems of the Filipino people. JMS takes the long view of the struggle for national and social liberation. He remains ever optimistic of the prospects of revolution and is unfazed by the length of time the struggle has taken. He again puts this in proper historical perspective relative to previous movements such as the more than 300-year anti-colonial struggle against Spain or the period that lapsed before feudalism was eventually supplanted by capitalism. His views of this are best expressed through his letter to the now departed Philippine National Artist for Literature, Bienvenido Lindera, in 2012. Almost a decade ago, he says, quote, I am confident that in our retirement years and thereafter, the Philippine Revolution will win far greater victories than we have seen since the start of the People's War in 1969. In writing you this long letter, I wish to share with you the optimism and confidence that our contributions to the Filipino struggle for national and social liberation are not in vain, and that they are part of a growing and advancing revolutionary movement that will ultimately win complete victory and lead to socialism. Maraming salamat po sa inyong pagbibigay ng puwang, for giving us time to share this very short book review, and it is an honor to be part of this event. Good day.
Great. Thank you so much, Nato, for sharing with us the significance of this timely book on the People's Democratic Revolution, PDR, even in the midst of election season in the Philippines and these new emerging candidates. And we really have to, again, echo the call to take these fundamental lessons and principles from this book, right? And the importance of joining the struggle for genuine change. So again, if you're curious about what are the lessons that we can learn from the ouster of Duterte's idol, Ferdinand Marcos, how can we actually amplify our demands for just and lasting peace in the Philippines? And so for those of you interested, we encourage you to purchase Professor Sison's 4th book of the Sison Reader Series. And so I think folks can see it in the links below in the chat, but if you're interested already in getting your copy right away, you should go to tinyurl.com/noblejms to check out Barnes & Noble. And then for those of you that have a Kindle, you can go to tinyurl.com/KindleBookJMS. So thank you, Nato, for that book review. So up next, we're actually going to welcome a cultural performance from Bootleg Orchestra, a song called War, which is an original song about Duterte's reactionary war against the people, linking to not only his dirty drug war, but his war on activists, right? And so this group, Bootleg Orchestra, is based in Los Angeles and recently released an album called Maki Baka. And so Dare to Struggle. And in this album, it's really a critique of capitalism, imperialism, and a call to action for all of us to organize. So this song War is a story about ordinary people fighting the wars of the ruling class when it's ordinary people who actually are bearing the brunt and the burden and suffering of these wars. And so it really talks about how it's important for us to really beg the question, for whom are these wars for? Is it for the people or for the ruling class? And we know that Duterte's reactionary war against the people is harming more people than ever before. And so it's really up to us to really question what does it mean to wage a people's war that's really for justice, the dignity, and also for revolution in the Philippines. So I'm going to pass it now to Bootleg to share their performance.
Each day gotta make your way, you know you really want a way out. Hearing what the troopers say, it's military on your mind now. You find out, it's time now, you want out, let go. It's time now, you get out, recruit now, you know. In the back now, it's the days you're questioning, is this the way out? To the front now, let it be your paycheck is a steady stream now. You find out, you let out, you want out, let go. It's time now, you get out, recruit now, you know. Did you really warn us? Saying war, war, catching fish to start. Now we hear they might destroy us, calling on the poor, poor, fight their dirty wars. Hands were made to serve a purpose. Tell us what's yours. Do you think we all deserve this? Tell us what's yours. Ready now, unveil the curtain. Ready now, unveil the curtain. Every day has purpose when you work and sleep to make each day count. Put your fingers on the trigger, shut that mother on her way out. You find out, you let out, you want out, let go. It's time now, you get out, this way now, you know. It's stolen and in greedy hands that mark your occupation. Now the people swore to kill off famine, carry world destruction. You find out, you let out, you want out, let go. Your time out, you get out. It seems like you know, seems like you care, yeah, yeah. It's time to be bold and change what you can, yeah, yeah. Calling out your war, war, catching fish to start. Now we hear you might destroy us, calling out the poor, poor, fight their dirty wars, fighting to defend this purpose. Tell us what's yours. Do you think we all deserve this? Tell us what's yours. Speech that makes your body nervous. War, war, catching fish to start. Now we hear you might destroy us, calling on the poor, poor, fight their dirty wars, fighting to defend this purpose. Tell us what's yours. Do you think we all deserve this? Tell us what's yours. Ready now, unveil the curtain. Ready now, unveil the curtain.
That was great.
Cool. Thank you all so much. I know there's some folks from Bulig Orchestra listening in as well in the mix, also part of Philippine U.S. Solidarity Organization. building support for the Philippine struggle. So thank you all for helping us with that cultural performance. It's great. I'm going to pass it to Elle to introduce our next book reviewer and our speaker.
All right. Next up, we will hear from Pao-Yu Ching. Pao-Yu Ching is a Chinese-American Marxist-Leninist Maoist economist. Her works focus on the socialist transition in modern China regarding its economics, but also the changes in society, culture, and women's rights. Some of her works include Rethinking Socialism, What is Socialist Transition, and more recently published by Foreign Languages Press, From Victory to Defeat, China's Socialist Road and Capitalist Reversal. Welcome, Pao-Yu Ching.
Hello?
Hello, Pao-Yu.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I guess you cannot see me, but you can hear me. That's enough.
They should be able to see you here.
Yeah. Okay, you can see me there. Yeah. Okay. Greetings. It's really good to see everyone. I'm very much honored to be included in the launching of Professor Jose Maria Sison's very important book, People's Democratic Revolution, Sison Reader Book 4. It is a very important book, and I read it from the beginning to the end and have learned so much from it. We can trace Professor Sison's analysis of the Philippines as a semi-colonial and semi-feudal society back to his earliest writings. Professor Sison has clearly shown us as a semi-colonial and semi-feudal society how the Philippines have been dominated by the imperialists with the help of the big comforter capitalists, the landlords, and the bureaucratic capitalists. Professor Sison explained to us so clearly that the people of the Philippines can only be liberated by a revolution whose objectives are national independence and democracy. Professor Sison and his comrades have not only actively participated in the revolution and have also been the leaders of the revolution. Therefore, we are reading Professor Sison's book as the living history of the Philippine Revolution. Presented by the great leader of the revolution. He explained that the revolution is no longer led by the liberal bourgeoisie. Instead, it is led by the working class in close alliances with the peasants. Thus, the name, the New Democratic Revolution. The Communist Party of the Philippines is responsible for the ideological, political, and organizational leadership in the entire revolutionary process. The Communist Party of the Philippines is guided by the teachings of Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism. It sets forth the program for the People's Democratic Revolution and is bound by the principle of democratic centralism. The New People's Liberation, the New People's Army under the Communist Party is based on the alliance of the working class and the peasantry to wage a protracted people's war to destroy the counter-revolutionary state, thus creating and enabling the rise of the People's Democratic Government in the countryside before nationwide seizure of cities. The program of the People's Democratic Revolution seeks to realize the basic demand of the people in the political, economic, social, and cultural fields in opposition to imperialism and the puppet state that is supported by the imperialists. The main demand for the realization of the full national sovereignty and democracy in favor of people, especially the toiling masses against the imperialism and the exploiting classes supported by the imperialists. Professor Sison explains to us the People's Democratic State of Workers' Peasants Alliance under the leadership of the working class must ultimately replace the reactionary state. The new democratic state can begin the economic development of the Philippines by implementing genuine land reform and national industrialization, so that the country can rise from the condition of underdevelopment, extreme exploitation, high unemployment, and mass poverty. After that, the socialist revolution can begin. It is utmost important for us to understand that Professor Sison has written a book not just for the Philippines, and nor is it just for the Filipino people. In today's world, most countries that are dominated by the imperialist countries are also semi-colonial and semi-cultural, semi-feudal. People in this country, like people in the Philippines, all suffer from the chronic crisis that has resulted lack of development, constant lack of jobs, mass poverty, and exploitation. People in the Philippines have endured the same hardship and misery as all the people in other semi-colonial and semi-feudal societies all over the world. As a leader of the long struggle in the Philippine Revolution, Professor Sison has shown us the only way to end the semi-colonial and semi-feudal society is to overthrow the foreign-dominated and supported regime. The fundamental change can only be brought upon by an armed revolution led by the Communist Party through the protracted People's War. Only after the revolution it will become possible for the country to launch the genuine land reform and national industrialization. In his book, Professor Sison has shown us 90% of the Philippine people are poor peasants, farm workers, poor fishermen, urban poor workers, peddlers, poor handicraftsmen, and unemployed living in city slums. They are the most important source of the revolution against foreign and domestic exploitation. Even though the composition of people in other semi-colonial and semi-feudal countries are not exactly the same as that of the Philippines, but they are very similar. For this country, the poor, the unemployed, and all those who have a hard time to survive from one day to the next also is the most important source of their revolution. Even though each country has its own special conditions, however, it is very well understood that in all these countries who are the friends and who are the enemies of the revolution. This country, like the Philippines, have to wage a revolution. This country, like the Philippines, have to wage a new democratic revolution against the imperialists and their domestic allies. It is absolutely clear imperialism is our largest enemy. And the only way we can defeat imperialism is to eliminate the basis for imperialism needs to feed itself in order to grow. And these bases are the semi-colonial and semi-feudal societies exist all over the world. Once these bases are eliminated, imperialism loses its source of nutrients, and dyes. Therefore, the revolutions to end the semi-colonial and semi-feudal society are the very important ways how we could succeed to end imperialism. Of course, the road of revolution is very hard and very long. Revolutionaries know how hard it is and how long it is. They have carried on the struggle for more than 1 generation now. Yet, the revolutionaries in the Philippines show us this is the only way for people to win their liberation, the only way people can be free again. Most importantly, they have shown us that people can indeed win this revolution. In this very important book, Professor Sison not only explains to the readers the essence of semi-colonial and semi-feudal society of the Philippines and what has to be done to fundamentally change such a society. Professor Sison also included in his reader book 4 many extremely important historical documents. I'm only listing 2 of them here, and but readers need to pay very careful attention to these documents. The titles of these historical documents tell us their importance when they were written, and that each of these documents is still extremely important today. They are the 1968 document for ratified by the Congress of Re-establishment of the Communist Party of the Philippines. In 1972, Guide for Establishing the People's Democratic Government. In 1984, a document calling onward with the struggle to dismantle the U.S. Marcos dictatorship. Included in these historical documents are also speeches and the keynote addresses and guides on various subjects given by Professor Sison. Reading these documents, one cannot help but feel Professor Sison's love and deep concern for the Philippines and the Filipino people. To conclude, I want to repeat People's New Democratic Revolution by Professor Sison is a very important book. Also, I want to use this opportunity to pay my highest respect to Professor Sison as the leader of the Philippine Revolution. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pao-Yu Ching. I think that was a very, very just insightful review and highlight of some major aspects of Professor Sison's work. I just wanted to highlight a few things that you mentioned, right? The Filipino people and so many people around the world who experience in semi-colonial and semi-feudal conditions are so familiar, right, with these conditions under US imperialism. But it's exactly the victory of the People's Democratic Revolution in the Philippines that will help to really take down imperialism that affects the oppressed people of the whole world. No, and you also highlighted, I think, aptly, the role, the leadership of the Communist Party and the essential role of the New People's Army to decisively end those conditions. And I think it's really appropriate. I think what you highlighted is really appropriate for our next cultural performance, which speaks to when the war is over. And what you highlighted around the plans and the direction we already have in building the People's Democratic Government. This song, Pagkatapos ng Digma, here was performed at the 5th International Assembly, Solidarity Night of the International League of People's Struggle. in 2015. And Pagkatapos ng Digma is a revolutionary song of hope. I think giving, paralleling well the outline and program that you described, Pao-Yu Ching. The People's War is part of the revolution, but after the war, we can look forward to genuine justice against oppressors, family reunification, and the steady rebuilding of the nation with the People's Democratic Government. So now we're going to listen to Pagkatapos ng Digma.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Definitely one of my favorite songs, Elle. An inspiring one that really talks about the abundance that can be really benefiting for the people themselves, right? And what would it mean to bring real criminals like the Marcoses and the Duterte clans to justice, right? And so for those of you that are curious, that was a cultural performance at the International League of People's Struggles, ILPS. If you'd like to join, be part of the anti-imperialist movement, it's also an alliance that Professor Sison is a founding chairperson of. So we've heard already a lot about the long-term change that's needed in the Philippines. We heard about the relevance of this book, The People's Democratic Revolution, outlining the solution that the people are hungry for. And now's your opportunity to actually ask questions for our speakers today. So we do actually have the honor of having Professor Sison with us, and also Pao-Yu Ching is with us today. And so I'll be moderating some of the questions. If you have any questions, please be sure to message them to the chat moderator. We're collecting all of these questions, but just to kickstart us off, one of the first questions that was received. So, hi, Professor Sison. Hello. All right.
Yes.
So one of the first questions is, what's the current state of the People's War, and how can people stay up to date with the growing developments?
Well, I will talk about the status of the revolutionary forces first, especially in the countryside, and then we shall try to see in what stage the People's War is in the course of probability, in the development of this People's War. So the New People's Army does not exist all by itself, but it coexists and cooperates with various revolutionary forces in the countryside. And so you have the leading party, the Communist Party of the Philippines. It has branches. Let's take the typical village, or the villages comprising a guerrilla front. Guerrilla front, as you know, is divisible into the guerrilla base and the guerrilla bases that surround the guerrilla base. But anyway, these are constituted by villages. So in a typical village, you have the branch of the party. Then you have, if you describe, if you wish to know the strength of the party nationwide, the strength is already in the tens of thousands, around 100,000. This grew from only 80 full and candidate members in 1968, And right in the village, you may have a unit. It could be a squad, which is part of a platoon in a guerrilla zone. So the squad can easily, you can imagine easily that it stalemates whatever the enemy has. And usually when you can put up a squad in a village, the enemy doesn't have anything anymore in terms of arm strength. And then this unit of the People's Army is supported by the People's Militia. It's a platoon size, but it is not so well armed, you have the self-defense teams of the revolutionary mass organizations. The People's Army is already in the tens, in thousands, starting from only 9 rifles in 1969 in one district, in one province in the Philippines. That means Tarlac. Then you have the revolutionary mass organizations of workers, peasants, women, youth, children, and so on. Then you have the organs of political power supported by all these aforementioned forces in a village. Now, let's go nationwide. Oh, well, I must first mention the revolutionary mass organizations in a village practically puts together in an organized way the 95% or more of the people. And then the organs of political power are supported. These are committees of self-government, or sometimes we call them organs of democratic power. And if you consider that these organs of political power have their expressions at higher levels, district and municipal level, district level, and provincial level, you have a whole structure of government. But the revolutionary movement does not announce where the people's government exists at higher level. Because when you say that the People's Army has already a regional government, and then the enemy will know exactly where to deploy to focus its strength. Or even just to say in which municipalities there is already, or districts or provinces where the people's government is already functioning, and then the enemy has direction in launching its offensives. So the people must understand why the propaganda, the information from the revolutionary news agencies will just refer to organs of political power at the village level. Now, the People's Army, like all those other revolutionary forces mentioned, is already spread nationwide. And it is deeply rooted among the toiling masses of workers and peasants. The operative areas, so to say, the areas which are active in developing the People's Army are what we call the guerrilla fronts, constituted by the guerrilla bases and guerrilla fronts. Now, this can be maintained by a full company. Right now in the Philippines, if you totalize the strength of the NPA, it has as many as 8 to 10 regiments already. But the formations as organic operational units are not made that way. There is no imitation of the Chinese experience, whereby in the course of the war against the northern warlords, and then in the agrarian uprisings, and then in the anti-Japanese struggle, usually the most effective, biggest units are the regiments. So right now, the People's Army is developing, trying to mature itself from the middle phase to the probable end of the strategic defensive, which is the threshold, where the threshold to the strategic stalemate begins. So the most effective units used by the NPA to carry out tactical offensives involves the use of platoons and companies, or even smaller units like squads, platoons, and companies. The time will certainly come depending on the circumstances, the time will come to have larger units like companies and battalions. I think that is the formation that will be most effective in the strategic stalemate. And then in the strategic counteroffensive, battalions and regiments will be deployed. Right now, it's the enemy using battalions and regiments against the NPA, and the NPA has to be agile and slippery. Must use tactics of concentration to do the offensive. It can retreat if the force of the enemy is too large, or it can even shift a whole company or a number of companies. It has flexibility. So right now, do not underestimate the strength of the enemy. You know, and the enemy, the strategies of the reactionary forces, of course, admit that the NPA is still the #1 threat to national security. That's how they express it. You know, even when the NPA is not fighting, by simply existing, it creates localized stalemate, even in the strategic defensive. So to distinguish localized stalemates, well, you can say that is here and there, no? But in the strategic stalemate, that is when, you know, on a nationwide scale, the enemy is already stalemated, no? But barrio for barrio, or town for town, you know, the usual strength of the police force in charge of the security of a municipality is merely a platoon. So when you have a platoon or company of the NPA, you can choose a time when you can use superior force. If the police force is unfriendly or there is a need to disarm the police force, the NPA can easily utilize superior strength, no? And the enemy is blind and deaf. It reacts only when it reacts only when so many offensives have occurred, and the big brother, the big army, comes in battalions or even a regiment to support the local police forces. So that's how the NPA is exactly in that phase or substage within the strategic defensive. That substage from the middle phase from the middle to the advanced phase. And in due course, the NPA will decide to raise the level of formations for offensives. The result is that the People's War is relatively gentle in the Philippines, despite 52 years of People's War. The NPA has wiped out so far only 13,300 of the army troops. You know, it is reported in the newspapers that 50 to 60,000 have been casualties in the People's War. Most of the casualties are actually civilians that become the target of retaliation by the enemy. Whenever the enemy gets a beating by the NPA, it it rages against the local communities. That's how, but then 50 to 60,000 in 52 years is a relatively small figure compared to the big wars. The Philippines, the great achievement of the New People's Army and all the other revolutionary forces in the Philippines is that it does not have the advantage of, let us say, the Chinese Revolution, which to some extent benefited from the existence of the Soviet Union. Of course, the Chinese Revolution was very self-reliant, but the Soviet Union gave support to the National Revolutionary Army of Sun Yat-sen, and the Communist Party was in alliance with the Kuomintang, and through that alliance, regiments came to be led by communist commanders. So it was possible for the Soviet Union to deliver weapons to the National Revolutionary Army. And then, of course, in the fight against Japan, it was also possible for the Soviet Union to give support. The only time that some Comintern people headed by Wang Ming messed up the strategy and tactics when they targeted big cities and got whipped. But when the anti-Japanese struggle came from late 1936 to 1945, the Soviet Union was able to give support to the Chinese. And of course, in the Indo-Chinese were able to take advantage of cross-border relations with the Chinese revolutionaries. The Philippines has had no such advantage because it is archipelagic, and the Philippine Revolution has been overtaken by the Deng Xiaoping reversal of proletarian internationalist policy of China. As early as 1975, Deng Xiaoping had put away Kang Seng, who, as well as Zhou Enlai, was at that time sympathetic to the Philippine Revolution. The Chinese support in any way dwindled to nothing, practically nothing, since 1974. And of course, when the restoration of capitalism took over in China, with the political overthrow of the proletariat in 1976, and the full-scale restoration of capitalism starting from 1978, the Philippine Revolution could not expect any help from any foreign source. So the Philippines has been thoroughly self-reliant, even more self-reliant than China. But thanks to the teachings of Mao, because Mao, you see, was the leading figure that built up the guerrilla bases in Chenkangsan, while the big names of commanders like Ye Chen-ying or even Zhou Enlai, who went along with the army units, showed that they benefited from the training and the arms of supplies that were carried on during the struggle against the northern warlords, and the Huampua military academy was set up. There's nothing like that in the Philippines. Attempts before, there were attempts before to get weapons from China, but that was it was only partially successful. And then there was no more opportunity to continue that. So and then the reactionaries like to mock the revolutionary movement. No? Oh, it has been running for 52 years, but it has not yet seized the Malacanang Palace. Well, the answer to that is the Communist Party has been establishing the people's government in the countryside, and in due course, it will be able to kick out those who are in power in Manila. And the people's government already exists in the Philippines, so it cannot be said that the revolutionary movement has been engaged in something futile, no? And then just consider Afghanistan, no? Say from the time that the Taliban was removed from Kabul by the U.S. NATO invasion to the current year, no? That's about 20 years. No, that's a long period of time, and the Taliban would be able to force out the U.S., make the U.S. realize that it was futile to go on trying to occupy. And it took some 20 years, even if the Taliban could get weapons through Pakistan. Pakistan doing a double face, you know, friendly to the U.S., but allowing military assistance from China. So,
speaking of Tito Joe, yeah, I think.
Anyway, that's a long explanation. Huh?
It's okay. It's actually related. You actually answered a lot of the questions that we received, but one of the particular questions that some of our audience is curious about is, how does the current inter-imperialist conflict between U.S. and China impact the prospects for advancement of the People's Democratic Revolution?
I will answer that question, but I will answer briefly the second question, which I have not been able to answer. How do you get information on the People's War? Well, there's the Philippine Revolution Web Collective, and if you have good access to various regions in the Philippines, they have their own news agencies. You know? The revolutionary forces have their regional and provincial agencies. Now, with regard to the current inter-imperialist conflict between the US and China, I think the two will be in a sort of stalemate for some time. Those who are afraid, especially some left liberals in the US, that the UN, other people, say in Australia, they fear that war is about to break out. No, there will be in a stalemate. And China is afraid to have war, no? But it can be aggressive where it can be at a tactical level. It is aggressive in taking over 7 islands in the Philippines. But you will see, it has not yet dared to, let's say, attack Taiwan and take over Taiwan. So you'll see the limitations. And you know, these two imperialist powers, they are afraid, as in the Cold War, the two superpowers were afraid to use their ultimate weapons. No? For instance, US, we cannot hit China because that will, the nuclear fallout, no? That will involve the Soviet Union and the Democratic People's Republic of China, of Korea. And then China does not dare, because I think it's still governed by the sense that it must continue to rise economically and militarily without having to go into a war. It has been the United States, as pointed out by former President Carter. It's been the United States that has been at war for more than 200 years, with the exception of only 16 years. You know? But China is a bit wiser, while you still have some leaders that have some background in Chinese strategic thinking from the time of Mao. But you see, changes in China could have a big consequence in the relationship with the U.S. and as well as in the situation in East Asia, especially the South China Sea area. You see, the China and the US are practically squeezing each other, and the US woke up to the so-called economic and military rise of China in the time of Obama, and Obama with the deep state behind Obama taking the policy of strategic pivot, to strategic pivot to East Asia, but then the U.S. could not easily pull out of its endless wars, so-called endless wars in Central Asia and West Asia. So, but by the time of Reagan, the deep state, this bipartisan strategies, in the U.S. imperialist state, has decided that to cut down the advantages that China has been getting from to cite just one thing, China has been getting a lot of from its trade surpluses in relations with the U.S., and China has been using this surplus to build up, to have the surplus capital, to play with. Let's say, so the China went into the Belt and Road Initiative. That's very alerting to the U.S. And then, of course, China shows occasionally how much military technology it has, but China shows off this technology just to show that it cannot be attacked without seriously hitting. The big changes could occur if, let us say, I still expect that in the future, those former socialist countries that took the capitalist road, the revolutionaries could reemerge. Say the Maoists in China, the Leninists in the former Soviet Union, because of the worsening crisis of the world capitalist system. And the balance in the stalemate and the mentalities involved could change if a revolutionary challenge occurs and then they resort to fascism. So what I call a peaceful stalemate, indefinite peaceful stalemate could turn into a really explosive situation, but we are not yet there. I think despite the severe crisis that the world capitalist system has gone through in 2008, and then in the second decade, there was another, the Great Recession, so-called, became the Great Depression, and then you have COVID. There are these conditions that could make certain imperialist powers desperate. If you read the newspapers nowadays, you see that China is getting squeezed. Its big companies are having debt troubles, and then there's not enough money in the central bank to fix the problem, and then also China thought it could very well gain economic control over certain countries, and there have been lopsided loans given to many countries, and then these countries now are resenting. Just to give you an example, China normally charges 3% for certain loans, and you know the Japan and the Western and international lenders would charge something like 1 to 2%. No, so there are these impositions that the Chinese have made, and of course the reaction or the defense of the debtors would be to make a debtors revolt. No, so there are now African countries and even Bangladesh and Pakistan are complaining, no, that they cannot comply with payments. So you have all these factors, and the situation can become volatile. But then the revolutionary movements can remind imperialist powers that they better avoid going to war, because the revolutionary movements will become stronger if the imperialist powers go into a fray, or they lose control over what they would like to control. No, that they would lose control over the countries that they would like to control. So you have this complicated situation, complicated and fluid. But we are not yet on the brink of a war between China and the US. I think the Philippines is affected by this conflict between US and China in this way. You know, I've already pointed out how Duterte has crazily mixed up the China Telecom and the US facilities and personnel in the same large military camps of the reactionary armed forces. But you see, this is the problem. Some reactionaries in the Philippines who are largely pro-US, no, because the US still number one in terms of investments and having so much political and cultural say in the Philippines. They would like to have the US military bases return, no? And US would have to provide the defense of the Philippines. And so, you know, the Chinese occupation of the islands in the West Philippine Sea has been a provocation. And but I think with two imperialist powers at odds, the revolutionary movement can find a way. No, I think let us say, if by its own strength, by their own strength, the Filipino people could liberate themselves, or they are on the verge of winning. And there are revolutionary movements going on and rising in other parts of the world. Then the Philippines can tell the Chinese, we support you on Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, over Tibet, over Xinjiang, and everywhere where the US, where the China has a legitimate sovereignty. Then, but please get out, no, and get out of the West Philippine Sea, and you even try to help us if you can before the revolution is won, or soon after the revolution is won. And you know, in the Philippines, despite the fact the Philippines is a porous I'm sure. Despite the Philippines is archipelagic, is archipelagic. It has also its own porosity in the south. The Muslim movements can be a big hole for U.S. and U.S. imperialism and the reactionaries to be unable to fill up. You see, the Muslim movements there have been able to get support from nearby countries. They have been in a better position than the non-Moro revolutionaries. So, well, there are so many factors to consider.
Thank
So
you
I hope,
so much. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for that that context. I think it's also important to know the historical context. Somebody asked in the chat, is Professor Sison a historian? Not only a historian, educator, but internationalist, right? We all must be. And so I think we have a time for only a couple more questions. And I also wanted to get this question in that is actually for Pao-Yu Ching. So one of our other speakers, what are the similar lessons from the Philippine ND movement to the revolution waged in China in the 20th century? And then what are the unique differences? So yeah, Pao-Yu Ching, if you're able to respond.
I don't quite understand the question. Could you explain the question?
Sure, it seems to just be asking what are some of like the similarities and differences between the Philippine Revolution and the Chinese Revolution?
The Philippine Revolution at this point, at this stage, is very much similar to the Chinese Revolution in the early stage of the Chinese Revolution, to have national democratic, to build a national democratic society. So very much, you know, you have a Communist Party, you have the People's Army, you have the coalition between the different classes, and the goal, the target is the imperialists and the allies of the imperialists.
Great, thank you so much, Pao. And then we have time for just one more question, and this is for Professor Sison to kind of help us close out today's book review. What are the most important tasks for those overseas in advancing the People's Democratic Revolution?
There are three important tasks of the overseas Filipinos. They must strengthen their own ranks, ideologically, politically, and organizationally. Second, they must find ways of concretely, morally, politically, and materially supporting the Philippine Revolution. You know, if you consider the Chinese Revolution, it got a lot of support from overseas Chinese, let's say before the World War II and after. And so with the Filipinos in the millions abroad, they can do a lot. And they can foresee the future in which Filipinos can bring their professional knowledge and technological skills to help in the socialist construction. But of course, your main concern now is how you can help the Philippine Revolution at the present stage. And what Filipinos can do foreign friends can do if you do well the third task, which is to promote solidarity with the American people and other peoples in the U.S. And you are part of course, of the big diaspora in more than of Filipinos in more than 100 countries. And so your international organization should be able to influence Filipinos on how to do solidarity work with their host peoples. But anyway, basically, a third task is to develop solidarity with other peoples, and you can provide them with information, and you develop the cooperation by which they can give moral and material support to the Philippine Revolution. You can even have joint delegations to the Philippines and learn the conditions there and how you can help exactly establish partnerships with progressive Filipino organizations, as well as those who are deeply involved in the higher form of struggle. And so you can have a Filipino delegation. You can also have a delegation of foreign friends, or joint delegations. That's easily done when you consider that there are films, there are Americans already, and they team up with those who have not yet become films, And the films are treated like Filipinos. Of course, they don't lose their nationality, even if they have adopted the U.S. citizenship.
Yes, it's true. So thank you so much, Professor Sison. So already giving us a preview of what's inside the book, but you actually have to purchase the book, right? It's 300 pages of a lot of good lessons, principles about the revolutionary movement. So thank you so much to our speakers, as well as to Professor Sison for partnering with Buy in USA and ILPS US on this book launch. I'm going to pass it over to Elle to kind of close us off.
Yes, thank you again. So be sure to purchase the book. Currently, they're only available in digital form. So folks will drop it in the chat. From Barnes & Noble, you can go to tinyurl.com/noblejms. And if you're using a Kindle, tinyurl.com/kindlebookjms. And it will be $10 US. We'll go to our final slide. We've come to the end of today's program. So maraming salamat again to Nato Reyes, Pao-Yu Ching, and Professor Sison. It was a pleasure hearing from all of you today. And as we end our time today, let's take what we've learned and continue to build the national democratic movement. As the People's War advances in the countryside, we should continue to grow the democratic movement in the cities as well as overseas. And even as the 2022 elections approach, let's not only continue to challenge the Duterte regime and the return of the Marcos dynasty, but continue to fight against the three basic problems, imperialism, bureaucrat capitalism, and feudalism. Only then can we have genuine national and social liberation. The Filipino people are at war, but we have a wealth of history, strategy, and political will to see that our land and our people are truly free. So thank you again to everyone for your time today. Isulong natin ang demokratikong revolusyong bayan hanggang sa tagumpay. Mabuhay ang sambayanang Pilipino.
Mabuhay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.